All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Australian Climate Commission's Community Forum. My name is Ryan Little. I'm a born and raised local of Alice Springs, and I work for the local television station here as a newsreader and reporter, and tonight I'll be the facilitator of this event. Okay, now the Commission's present tonight are Professor Tim Flannery, Mr Jerry Houston, Professor Leslie Hughes, Professor Will Steffen, and Dr Suzanne Elliott. But, ladies and gentlemen, before we start this evening, I would like to introduce Barbara Satur, a native title holder from Luratupa Aboriginal Corporation, to perform a welcome to country. Make your way up, please, Annie Barb.
My name is Barbara Satur, those who don't know me. I'm a member of the Little family, and I'm a traditional owner of Mbarantu, which is Alice Springs. I'm a director on the Luratupa Aboriginal Corporation. We're made up of 3 estate groups. One is Undulu, is the east of us. Ilkmer is up on the north, and Mbarantu is in the middle. We called our corporation Luratupa, meaning the banks of the river. Lura is the banks of the river, and the tupa is the backbone or the spine. So I always say that the Todd River is our backbone and spine of Alice Springs because it runs through the centre of the town. And when the Todd flows, it's a healing feeling, I think, and it's a cleansing of the town. So everyone who's witnessed it or saw that tide flow any time in their lifetime, they know the feeling of it. So thank you very much for having me here, and enjoy the forum. Thank you.
Thank you, Annie Barb. Okay, also the aim of the evening is to begin a conversation. The Commission is here to listen, as well as to share some of their knowledge and their background of their experiences. We'll hear from them on what they've heard and seen in Alice Springs today, and there will also be an opportunity to ask questions for the Commission. But firstly, a brief introduction of Professor Tim Flannery, the Chief Climate Commissioner. Professor Tim Flannery is one of Australia's leading writers on climate change and an internationally acclaimed scientist, explorer and conservationist. He was named Australian of the Year back in 2007 and is currently Panasonic's Chair in Environmental Sustainability at the Macquarie University. Professor Flannery has held various academic positions, including Professor at the Macquarie University, Director of the South Australian Museum in Adelaide, Principal Research Scientist at the Australian Museum, and Visiting Chair in Australian Studies at Harvard University in the Department of Organismic and Evolutionary Biology. So please, ladies and gentlemen, make him feel welcome. Professor Tim Flannery.
Well, thank you very much for that welcome, and thank you, Barbara, for that very beautiful welcome to country. That was fantastic. This is the Climate Commission's 13th event, believe it or not, going around Australia talking about climate change, and I'm very pleased to be here in Alice Springs because it's the first time that we've been in the Northern Territory. I'd just like to tell you a bit about the Commission and how it works, and then we'll hand over to you because this really is your evening. This is, we think, your opportunity to interact with our commissioners and ask whatever you want about any aspect of climate change. The Climate Commission is an independent authority. We've been set up by government and we're funded by government, but we're independent of government. So we don't take directions from the Minister, for example. And our brief is a very simple one. It's really just to get out there among the Australian community, make the expertise of the commissioners available and engage in a dialogue on all aspects of climate change. We think it's an important job because climate change is going to be with us for many years to come, that's for sure. We'll still be discussing issues and making hard decisions in 2050, just as we're doing this decade. And in a democracy without a well-informed public in terms of these issues, it's going to be easy to make mistakes. So we think what we do is important. Because we're independent, we don't give opinions really on government policy or even opposition policy. There's plenty of people who do that. You'll find them anywhere. We figure if we do that, if we refrain from giving opinions about policy, we'll become known over time more as an authoritative, independent source of information for people, so that you can come to your own conclusion about things rather than hear opinions from us. I'd like to briefly introduce the Commission and give an idea of their expertise. We've got near me there Professor Leslie Hughes of Macquarie University, who is a world authority on the impacts of climate change on biodiversity, so on plants and animals, but also on the area of adapting to climate change. We have Professor Will Steffen next, who's really one of the great international scientists in terms of climate change, particularly the modelling and the global system and how it works and the impact of greenhouse gases on the Earth system as a whole. So Will is really the person to go to if you've got any questions on the science of climate change. We next have Susanna Elliott, Dr. Susanna Elliott from the Australian Science Media Centre. She's an expert on the communication of science. The Australian Science Media Centre does a fantastic behind-the-scenes jobs, really, making sure that science is properly represented in all the media in Australia. And at the end there we have Jerry Houston, who for 34 years was in the oil and gas industry, was president of BP Australasia and has recently stepped down. And he's a great person to approach with any business questions because coming from business and having thought long and deep about climate change, he is a real expert in that area. The one person we haven't got with us, one commissioner we don't have with us this evening is Roger Beale, our economist. So we'll do our very best to answer economic questions and recall what Roger said on previous occasions, but we do apologise that he's not available to you this evening. We start off with a brief presentation of climate science, impacts in this area, and a brief look at potential opportunities. And as soon as that's over, we're going to hand over to the floor for you to ask your own questions, because that's really our purpose for being here. Without further ado, I'll hand over to Will Steffen to begin the presentation. He'll then hand on to Leslie, he'll hand on to me, and then we'll go over to questions from the floor. So thank you. Will, please go.
Okay. Thanks very much, Tim. As Tim said, we get a lot of common questions about the basics of the science and what the implications might be. So just to save some time, we'll give you a very brief introduction to it. So we'll start with probably the most iconic piece of scientific data that we use in climate science, and that's the global surface air temperature record from about 1880, which is where we first had thermometers, up to the present. And you can see that every year is not warmer than the one before it. There's a lot of variability from year to year and even over 10-year periods. But the long-term trend, at least since the middle of the last century, is quite clear. The Earth is warming, and it's warming at a rate of about 0.17 degrees Celsius. Since we started the record here, the overall increase is about 0.8 of a degree, a little under 1 degree Celsius, which is actually quite a large change. But interestingly, scientists, although this is an important piece of data, spend just as much time on this next one. This is the ocean heat content. Now, why would we be interested in that? It turns out that about 90% of the extra heat that's being trapped at the Earth's surface actually goes into the ocean. It doesn't go into the air or the land. So for climate scientists, this is really an important piece of data. Again, you can see since about the 1960s or 70s, there's been a clear increase in ocean heat content, which again is telling us that we have a global problem, a global imbalance. And there's even more data we use. This is the Arctic sea ice, in other words, the ice that floats over the North Pole and the ocean around it. And you can see over time, again from 1900, these red jagged lines, that's the observational data. We're losing that sea ice at an increasing rate as we go through time. The line that actually goes out to 2100 is obviously not observations because it hasn't occurred yet. That's an example of a climate model and what a climate model predicts. And you see up here, the climate model does pretty well about the middle of last century. But then as we go through time, the climate model is too conservative. In fact, it's not predicting how fast the climate system is actually moving, and that's true for many of the climate parameters. So the point here is we have a wealth of evidence that the Earth is warming, and scientists don't debate that anymore. That has been settled for quite a few decades. We use the term unequivocal to describe our confidence in that bit of science. Well, you might ask why. Some people say, well, the Earth is always warmed and it's always cooled. So why isn't this just natural variability? Well, I could go on for the next couple hours to tell you all the evidence. There's a mountain of it that tells us that this is not natural variability. But the basic piece of evidence is we actually know the physics really well. And the warming is due to these things called greenhouse gases, a belt of gases a few kilometers up in the air above the Earth's surface. The principle is very simple. Sunlight from the Earth warms the Earth's surface, and as it does so, the Earth has to give the equivalent amount of energy back into space, or else we would continually warm and burn up. and we don't. But the Earth gives it back not as light, but as heat. And these gases let the light through, but they trap the heat. And fundamentally, that's the greenhouse effect. So that extra heat that's trapped below this belt of gases warms the lower atmosphere and the surface, the land, the oceans, the ice. And that's what's causing the warming we're seeing now. As I said, I could go through a very exhaustive list of evidence, but I'll just give you one piece because it's quite interesting to see this. Now here's a graph from 1900 to 2000, and there's nothing on it yet. So what we're going to do is test our climate model, because our climate model actually has the physics of the greenhouse effect built into it. There are other things that affect climate, of course. Sunlight varies, volcanoes occur, and so on. So we can tell our model from 1900 to 2000, put in all the natural variability that people like to talk about, and we can do that, and that's what temperature would have done. Temperature is not steady naturally, it varies, and that's how it would have varied, okay? But then we can tell our climate model, leave all the natural variability in, but add in the greenhouse gases, because we know how much additional greenhouse gas we've put in. So we do that, and that's what our climate model does. Look, it diverges around 1950, and it says greenhouse gases will have a measurable impact after the middle of last century. Now we see a difference. We can test the model because this has already occurred. So we send our Bureau of Meteorology scientists out and we say, go measure what actually happened, and the scientist does that, and that black line is what actually happened. So this tells us that the model is dead right in terms of the basic energy balance at the Earth's surface, that you cannot simulate what's actually occurred unless you include human emission of greenhouse gases. Now I could go on, but there's a mountain of evidence that says we know exactly what's going on. And this is the science on which the policy is being made. But what really matters for people are not those big global averages of what's happening in temperature. It's what's happening in Alice Springs, what's happening in Canberra, Brisbane, Perth, and so on. And there what we tend to look at are extremes. It's the really hot days or the heavy rainfall that causes us problems, like what happened in Melbourne in 2009. You might say, well, 1 degree or 2 degrees temperature increase, why do we worry about that? If it goes from 27 to 29, what does that matter? Well, it's these extremes that matter, because around every average you have some relatively cold temperatures and then you have some hot temperatures. That's just the nature of a noisy system like the climate. So if we add a little bit to that average, not very much, we just shift it a little bit, what you see is that what used to be classified as hot weather occurs much more frequently. And you get some really extreme hot weather that never occurred before, record hot weather. It's this that really clobbers us in society. And here's an example in Melbourne where we take a transport system that was designed for the old grey climate, that grey bell curve. We shoved it into the new climate and it fell over because the engineers hadn't accounted for that. So this gets us into the area of impacts and consequences and why these shifts in climate actually matter and why we're taking such pains to start getting emissions down. So let's go right closer to home to the impacts on Central Australia, and I'd like to turn it over to my colleague Leslie Hughes, who's an expert on impacts. She'll tell you what's happening to your part of the world.
Thanks, Will. Okay, let's bring it closer to home. This first graph here, I don't know if you can see the red, but that shows what's happening to the temperature, what's been happening to the temperature in the Northern Territory. And you can see that it's been highly variable, and that's because in the Northern Territory there are actually a lot less weather stations than there are in other states, so that the temperature record is naturally more variable from year to year because we don't have a lot of things to average over. But as you can see, like the rest of Australia and like the rest of the world, the territory's been getting hotter. Now, the map of Australia there with the colours on it, the green colours show where it's been getting wetter over the last 40 years, back to 1970, and the brown areas are where it's been getting drier. And that red box, of course, is Central Australia. And as you can see there, the few weather stations that we have do indicate that it's been getting drier overall in Central Australia. So what about the future? Well, these maps show some modelling done by the CSIRO and published a few years ago for temperature into the future. The two top maps are for 2030 and the two bottom maps for 2070. The main thing I want you to notice, which is relevant to you and where you live, is that the darker orange colour is in Central Australia. Central Australia, the arid regions, are projected to get warmer relatively faster than the coastal regions. So the whole of Australia will get warmer. It will happen more in Central Australia, where you are here. So what does this mean in terms of impacts? Well, obviously we're talking about the future, so we're speculating. Even tomorrow is a speculation as to what will happen, but we're reasonably confident about some of these impacts. So firstly, as it gets warmer, and especially if it gets drier, the conditions that promote more frequent and intense fires will be got to more often. So we're expecting over most of Australia more fires and hotter fires in the future. Secondly, and that's a picture of your hospital up there, there'll be more pressure on the health system, especially from increasing hot weather. We know that hot weather causes people to die, even in a developed country like Australia, and increases the incidence and severity of all sorts of chronic diseases. Some other potential impacts for this region. The rainfall projections are very uncertain. The models are not very good at projecting rainfall because it's a very, very complicated thing to do. But what we can say with some degree of certainty is that when we get rain, it will come in more intense events, and that will promote flooding events. Thirdly, if we do get an ongoing pattern of drying, obviously water resources, especially in a place like Central Australia, will come under increasing pressure. Thirdly, of course, as it gets hotter, everybody turns on their air conditioners when you have them, and so there'll be intense pressure at very hot times on the electricity supply, potentially leading to blackouts. And lastly, Central Australia, of course, relies very heavily on tourists, and as it gets hotter, it's expected that the tourist season will contract because, of course, people won't come here when it's really, really hot. So they're just some of the potential impacts for this region. Finally, I want to talk about the future in a more personal way. Now, scientists like Will and I put up graphs like this all the time, and we know that it's, scientists love graphs, but sometimes they're a bit hard to relate to. So I want to relate to this one rather personally. What it actually shows, firstly, is that little black wiggly line is the temperature that we've already had, similar to the graph that Will showed at the beginning. The red area and the blue area of this graph show two potential futures for us and our world. The blue future is if we are able to strongly control the emissions of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases, we may be able to have a chance of keeping temperature increases to just 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels. And that's that band of blue there, and that 2-degree line has sort of been picked as the arbitrary line above which really dangerous things start to happen. If we don't limit greenhouse gas emissions the way we ought to, and if we continue on in what we call a business as usual scenario, then it's that red band that we're looking forward to going through to the end of this century. So to relate this, to get a bit more personal about it, that's my lifespan there, my projected lifespan. I was born in the 1960s, and if I live till I'm about 85, I've drawn that bar at around about the average temperature that I will experience over my lifespan. It's not too bad. Now, I've got 2 teenage children, born in the mid-90s, and if they live till they're about 85, that's their potential average temperature that they will experience over their lifespan. Now, I don't have grandchildren yet, but assuming my kids have kids when they're about 30, my grandchildren will live beyond 2100, and under a business as usual scenario, that's the average temperature that my grandchildren could experience over their lifetime going forward. What we really need to do is actually bring that temperature line down to below the 2 degrees. And why we're here is our main message is that this is the critical decade where urgent action is needed to achieve that goal. Thanks very much.
I just want to spend a couple of minutes looking at what we need to do in terms of dealing with climate change. There's a number of things here. There's a progression of issues. One is that we have to price pollution. Another way of saying that is you've got to get the polluter to pay. And the only way we've ever been able to establish a civilisation is by abiding by that principle. Otherwise our streets would be ankle deep in sewerage and there'd be all sorts of pollution problems from the very earliest times right through to the present. And we've just exerted a cost on people who pollute. Sometimes it might be telling a little kid not to throw his rubbish in the street. Other times it's paying a cost to get rid of that pollution. The carbon pollution problem is no different. We need to put a price on carbon, and it's generally recognised by economists that the most cost-effective way of doing that is to allow the free market to deal with the problem. So establish a carbon market rather than through a regulatory response, for example, where you might get a bureaucrat telling business how to go about doing things. We also know that we need to give business certainty, because that is just absolutely central to long-term investment decisions that are needed, particularly in the energy sector where a company has to invest in a piece of infrastructure that might last 50 years. They really want to know that government policy isn't going to be changing every year. And that applies to every level of government, federal, state and all the rest. Reward innovation and investment, same sort of thing. Clearly, you move things along at a faster rate if you can do that. And plan for a low carbon future, and that's in terms of our educational sector and everything else that makes sense to make sure that people are getting trained for jobs that will exist in future. So the way it generally works, and sorry I've got to turn around a little bit to see, we impose a price on pollution, which you can see there, and those costs are then passed on to businesses and households, and that stimulates people to reduce consumption or make low emission choices or just be more efficient in terms of the energy that they use. And then the pollution's reduced and you get more investment in clean energy technology. Of course, that shift to the new low emissions economy, it has some costs, as I've just outlined, that we have to pay, but it also has enormous benefits. And I should just say that the costs are unavoidable. No matter how you do it, no matter how you deal with the pollution problem, it does mean paying an investment in the future. But the opportunities, as we've travelled around Australia as a Climate Commission, we've realised that the opportunities for regional Australia are particularly strong. In Queensland, we saw examples of sugar refiners, sugar mills, that were using their waste products to generate electricity and giving them a very valuable income stream because they were able to secure long-term electricity contracts. In one instance, we saw a sugar mill was supplying a third of the electricity used by a major regional town, Mackay, in central Queensland, using a low carbon source of energy. Of course, with investments in things like photovoltaics, you've already seen here in Alice Springs how this place can act as a hub for providing data on how different sorts of photovoltaic systems compare. In future, I'm sure we're going to see the rolling out of very large-scale solar-based systems. No one knows exactly what they'll be yet, but I'm sure that in future we'll see arrays like this, hundreds of megawatts of array with the capacity to store the energy that's produced. There's also lots of opportunities for the agricultural sector. The Carbon Farming Initiative, which is agreed by both sides of politics, offers some real opportunities, I think, for farmers and land managers throughout Australia to benefit from sequestering carbon in various ways, and we can discuss that perhaps a little bit later on during question time. At the moment, though, I think what's really important is that people are properly informed about the options that we face in future, that we can be positive about a clean energy future, because it's not just all costs, there are advantages as well. And of course, if you're paying more for your electricity, it makes sense to make practical changes at home. I know about this personally because my house doesn't have mains power. I have only solar power at home, and we've had to be pretty careful, to be honest with you, about making sure that we buy very efficient goods. And that also involves a little bit of a more cost up front, but in the longer term you pay far less. It's also important that communities work together to take advantage of some of the opportunities that are coming. We've seen in places like Geelong and Wollongong, communities working very closely to make sure that they grab the opportunities as they come through. So educational institutions, businesses, local councils and so forth, really developing proper plans for their region to make sure they get their fair share of investment in the new energy economy. And of course, it's important to be creative with all of this, just moving forward with family, engage the kids. One of the things that I did years ago when I was paying power bills, when I did have mains power, was challenge the kids to reduce the electricity use. And the way I did it was said, well, you know, if we can lower this bill by $50 over the next quarter, I'll give the money to you as pocket money. And I tell you, they became energy Nazis very quickly. So that sort of thing does work. Anyway, that's enough from us. That's our presentation. So we're going to go back to our moderator now, who will facilitate a question and answer session. And please feel free to ask anything you want of our commissioners. Thank you.
Thank you very much to the commissioners. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we are now entering the business phase of the night, where you will have an opportunity to ask questions from the Commission. Now, a number of you have pre-registered questions, which I have here in my hand, so we're going to take a combination of questions that you ask here and the questions which have been submitted before the forum.
My question is actually to the person who's representing business, I think. I'm just wondering how the business community is generally at the moment. You know, are they supporting the science, or are they still, I feel, giving a lot of misinformation to the community?
I think that's a great question because you know, if you look at the coverage you see in the media and a lot of the commentary out there, you'd think that business was you know, firmly with its head in the sand. So from my experience, and I was on the board of the Business Council of Australia until recently. BP was very proactive in trying to create the right sort of level of business certainty, in which we were part of the solution for a number of years. I would say the majority of big business out there certainly accepts the significant risk, and the majority of them would also say that they accept the science. Even the ones who don't accept the science say that there's a big risk out there and we've got to do our bit to mitigate it. And at the moment you're seeing a lot of jockeying going on because there's a legislative process going on, and there's going to be winners and losers. So naturally businesses are going to look at their short-term bottom lines and their shareholders in the short term to get the best position possible. But I would say that once things settle down, then you know, you won't get a tremendous amount of noise from most of business. In fact, most of business, certainly the ones that I was associated with, have already factored in a price on carbon for a number of years. The sorts of things that business was looking for were a degree of certainty. They don't want policies flip-flopping around on something as important as this, because as Tim said, you're investing for 20, 30, 40 years sometimes, so you can't afford to have a big risk hanging out there that the government's going to change its mind every 5 minutes. There is a transition period where, you know, some countries overseas will be moving slower than other countries, so you need to recognise there are trade-exposed industries. The most efficient way to mitigate it needs to be found, and the general belief, I think, as Tim said, was to use a market-based mechanism. To have a market-based mechanism, you generally need a price. So, you know, carbon needs to be priced, and with that market-based mechanism, it won't do everything, but it will certainly create a market, and then the other initiatives need to be selectively supported if the market doesn't work. So those are the sorts of things that business has been saying to all sides of politics, and And I would say behind the scenes, that the majority of businesses are actually supporting, but they're at the moment they're obviously negotiating. The other thing that business recognises, there's no silver bullet for this. This is not an easy thing to solve. It's multi-generational, and it's going to need more than just one solution. It's going to need to be broad-based, things that we know today, things we'll learn tomorrow. And if you let the market work to achieve the aims, then the market generally is the most efficient way to get there.
Good first question.
Today on ABC, the local radio, I heard one of the senators talking about the legislation, and he was still talking as though the science didn't exist. And so I'm just wondering, when is this going to finish, and when can business, in particular, put pressure on people so that, we get over this, what I call misinformation?
Yeah, I don't think you'll find too much misinformation now coming from business, and I don't think you'll see too much what I'd call, denying the science within business. But business is risk reward, and even if you didn't believe the science, and there are some colleagues out there who don't believe it, you'd have to ask them for the reasons. That's fine; they're entitled to their views. But when they look at the risk, and if you just think about it, 97% of the world's best climate scientists say it's unequivocal. So you'd have to say that you'd have to take out some insurance against that for something that's almost a certainty. As a businessman, you'd have to take out some insurance, and that's what most business would say anyway. Then you've got, okay, so now we've got to balance the short term and the long term, and that's where I think the debate goes today.
Thank you. Next question. At the back, the man in the orange shirt, please.
I don't have a question. It's more just a challenge to your statement that you're expecting more and intense fires in Central Australia, and I suggest that you've brought a southern view to that. Fire is driven by rainfall here, and hotter weather and more intense rain won't necessarily lead to more grass growth and more fires. So really the challenge we face in terms of fire management, which is a very important land management tool, is that as we're learning to use it, we may have to change the approach that we're taking, because the opportunities to burn are probably going to be less rather than more.
Look, fire, as you would know, of course, is one of the most challenging and complex things to predict. And absolutely the amount of fuel, which is driven by water availability, is an incredibly important part of that equation. Point taken. I think what we need to do going forward is just to adapt to a regionally specific best projection of what might happen in the future. Yeah.
Thank you. My name's Robert Gates, and I share the concerns about the increased fire risk in Alice Springs. We have a grass called buffalo grass, which the farmers brought in, and anybody not sure about our fire intensity? Well, we've had some big fires. My issue tonight that I'd like to talk about is housing options. Currently you have a tendency in Australia where we're building bigger houses and usually putting one or two people in them. And I don't think that trend can continue. And what we need to do is look at a higher density living systems, and we also need to look at efficient building design. And coming from a science background myself, efficient building design is close to my heart. There's a good example down in the mall. I invite all you eminent people to go and have a look at what they built in the early stages, the 1919, 1920 or something like that. The old hospital has got a very, very interesting design. It's about the only one you'll see in town, and for the life of me I can't see why, because we're all hell-bent on putting in air conditioners and turning the switch on. And I'm also interested in your remote area power supply. We've recently had problems with getting diesel fuel out to communities. What? This is the 21st century we're talking about. Surely we should be going solar.
Do you, I think, too?
Sure. Look,
comment on that?
Just to respond, I think you're absolutely right about all of that. And if we take a national level approach to this, you can see that some governments are trying to do something about that. So in Melbourne, for example, the City of Melbourne, and in Sydney, there's an attempt to move to higher density and to plan for local energy generation and greater energy efficiency and so forth. But, we've just come through a period of this incredible urban spread where people have taken the size of their house as being some sort of status symbol or some comment on their value in society. So they built the biggest house they possibly can, and energy's been cheap, so it hasn't mattered that much that they've been very inefficient. But that's changing really rapidly. I think in New South Wales, energy prices have gone up 40% in the last 2 years. So they're quite substantial, and that's got nothing to do with the carbon tax or anything else. It's just the fact that poles and lines are wearing out and need to be, and transformers and so forth, and need to be replaced. So I absolutely agree with you with all of that. You know, in a sense, what you're saying is that, you know, we can't afford to do things stupidly anymore. We've got to substitute a bit of thinking into the process for materials, so we can be much more efficient with our materials, with our electricity use and everything, if we just think a little bit about planning and how we want to live.
I was just wanting a bit more information about what Tim Flannery mentioned about compensation for landowners, because I know that in the Northern Territory, large-scale cattle stations are a big part of the economy. And I was just wondering whether you think that they will be made to pay a carbon tax or completely change the way that they do things, considering how energy intensive they are, but also considering how much uncleared land that they have.
Sure. Look, I'll just, perhaps Will might have something to add to this, but I think I should just outline the basics first. Agriculture is excluded from the carbon tax scheme. So there's the 500 largest polluters, the industrial polluters, you know, power plants, cement mills and so forth. They're paying it, but agriculture isn't. Now, I suppose people on the land, just as people anywhere, will face some increase in costs, and that's true. I've yet to see how big that is, but the projections are that it's not going to be massive, but we shall see. In terms of carbon farming, though, and the interaction between, say, landowners and the whole scheme, there are some real opportunities there, and I'll just give you one example of that. In 2008, CSIRO published a very important desktop study looking at how changes in burning practice from the current very hot fires we get across Northern Australia through to a better fire management program based on Aboriginal fire management might help reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And that study showed that they looked at 6 properties, indigenously owned properties across Northern Australia. It showed that there was a potential benefit for all of them, ranging between about $60,000 per annum to over $200,000 per annum, if the carbon price was $20. Now we know it's going to be more than that. And furthermore, when they looked at the potential of indigenously owned land across Australia, I think Northern Australia, they saw that there might be up to $52 million a year in terms of payments to avoid emissions at a carbon price of $20 a tonne. So that's just one example of how land management might change in order to avoid emissions and gain a payment. So I think there are substantial opportunities on the land. And could I just say out here, I saw a comment by someone in the media, I think it was a senator, about how we could never use solar power to drive tractors and so forth, you know, on the land. That's absolute rubbish. I know I've got a mate who farms at Bathurst who's got a solar tractor already. He powers it straight off the roof of his house and ploughs all of his fields with it, and does a very good job too. So.
My name's Kelly Lee. I'm a community development worker in Alice Springs. My question is about social equity. Poverty is a really big issue for us in Central Australia, and there's been significant government investment required to tackle some of these issues. A, how are we going to continue to fund the investment we need to tackle social issues and climate change? And B, what can we do to make sure that all of these initiatives enable us to build a more equitable society as well?
I just want to say one quick thing about that, because one of the other hats that I wore for a while was I was a member of the Multi-Party Climate Change Committee, which actually developed the legislation which went through yesterday. And one of my colleagues in an advisory role was Patricia Faulkner, who spent a lot of time advising the committee on exactly that issue. So what you'll see is that unlike many others around the world, this particular package actually takes that into account. Now, they've done it through the tax system, by raising the threshold quite a bit, and by lowering taxes for the people at the lower end of the income bracket. So what that does is it more than compensates for the projected rise in electricity, and what it does is allow people in those income brackets to use that extra income on whatever they would like. So that's a first step at trying to build in equity considerations into how we deal with the climate change issue. And there's obviously more that can be done, but it is an issue that is on the agenda.
Living in absolute poverty, though, that does nothing to impact the people who are living in absolute poverty, like people in Central Australia who don't actually have any access to electricity. What I'm concerned about is that we've seen predicted rises in chronic disease. Chronic disease affects the most vulnerable people in our community. I'm fearful that we're going to see cuts to social services that are required to support some of the most vulnerable people in our community. Furthermore, we have remote communities where people are still living on traditional lands, and with increased carbon taxes, those people are no longer going to be able to travel into town to access services due to increased fuel costs. And for these people, I fear that the tax cuts, which would impact people like myself, may not actually affect these people, because we're talking about people living on Centrelink.
Okay, just quickly, the tax is not on people. The tax is on the 400 to 500 largest polluting companies. So the issue there is, how does that filter through the system? The second thing is, the tax is not on fuel for personal vehicles usage. That was exempt from the system. So fuel prices may go up, and if they do, it's for entirely different reasons that have nothing to do with the pricing of carbon. But I agree that you've raised a huge social issue. But I think that obviously that needs to be dealt with by our society in ways that aren't confounded by dealing with the climate change issue. We obviously have to deal with both. I don't know whether Leslie wants to say something about the health issue.
Can I just add something, just to reinforce what you said, rather than providing answers? But one of the things that the Commission is doing is releasing a series of reports on the impacts of climate change, and our first big one will be on health, which will be released very soon. It's almost ready to go. And following up on that, there will be a specific smaller report on the impact on Indigenous health, and particularly on remote Indigenous communities. And the health report, we really emphasise how the health impacts of climate change in a developed country like Australia will fall disproportionately on those most vulnerable in society already. So the elderly, children, and especially the poor and remote Indigenous communities. So I'm not saying we're providing the answers to those problems, but we're hoping to certainly highlight the vulnerability of those communities to climate change in the future.
Hi there, my name's Mark Carter. My question is, how do the panel feel about the increasing entrenchment of the climate change debate in terms of left and right in politics? In Europe, it's become a kind of like not a left-right issue, but in the USA, it's become firmly a left-right issue, and Australia's following the American trend. We've got half of politics is bitterly opposed to kind of the reality of climate change, and generally very hostile to actually actively doing anything about it. I know that people say once the reality sinks in, they'll get on board, but on issues, things like other things like birth control, for example, the right are completely too immune to reality on that one. They stick to their theological position. So, and also, are you a bit worried that you're just preaching to the converted tonight? And I don't know, is there anyone here from the Liberal Party? Is that? No?
Good question.
Jerry. I think there's an optic here, and then there's the reality. So if we just actually get away from the sort of the way the debate has been portrayed and led politically, I would suggest, as well as through the media, there are some realities there. So both sides of both major parties in Australia accept the science. They've accepted the report that the Climate Commission put out recently, and they're unequivocal in that. So that's the mainstream of the party and the leadership. So that's done. They're both committed to a 5% reduction from 2000 levels by 2020. Both parties are committed to that, and that is regardless of what anyone else in the world does. So those are the commitments there. So when you actually look at the reality, both are committed to doing something about it. The debate is about how you do it. And then I think there's also a debate going on that is purely political. I remember I was given a piece of advice by a wise politician years ago when I was frustrated by what was happening, and he said, well, on one hand, Jerry, you've got politics, and on the other hand, you've got reality. So, and ultimately, we will, you'll never see perfect policy come out, of a democratic process. Very rare, I would say, but you'll get policy moving in the right direction. But there'll always be people who say, well, something could have been done better. But I think if you look at the reality of the politics, I would say that the mainstream of Australian politics on both right and left of the divide fully accept the reality of the issue. And are committed to doing something about it. The question is how you go about it. And at the moment, I would say there's a short-term issue with politics getting in the way of it. And I think you're seeing the same thing in the US. But you look at the reality in the US, a lot of the states are going to be far more progressed than Australia in 5 or 10 years' time. Likewise in Canada. So the debate is going on, but also the drive to actually take us to a lower carbon economy is also happening pretty universally across the world, despite the political rhetoric that we sometimes see.
If I can add to that, I think it's also really important that we don't get too focused on the media, because the media does highlight the differences rather than similarities. That's the nature of the media. Plus, there's also a lot of opinion out there. Much of the modern media, as you would know, is very focused on opinion these days rather than facts. And so it's also very important, I think, just not to get too disheartened by the vitriolic debate that you see going on in the media, which doesn't necessarily represent the mass opinion of people. It's one thing very clear. Now, going back to your point about whether we're preaching to the converted, this is an interesting question, and it is something that we've talked quite a bit about. But one of the things we think is really important is that all of the people who come to a forum like this are communicators, and basically. I know that for myself, when I'm out in the community talking to people, even if it's at a party, when I'm talking to my parents, when I'm talking to my siblings and friends, what makes that conversation more productive is when I have more knowledge. And I think when we come out to communities and we can talk to people and they go away with more knowledge, then that helps them to talk to other people. And by that you can communicate much, much further than just within this room.
My question, I think, is a pretty obvious one. I think the elephant in the room, to me, is population, the human population. So I think that we're having a conversation on the periphery about what we can do by putting up some solar panels and riding a push bike and stuff. But until we talk the proper way about human population. And the second part of that question would be, I think we have aspirations for people in the third world to have a greater level of consumerism to support them. Aren't we going to have to give up some consumerism and some population to get to greater equity?
Look, I think that's a good question. I always seem to get tossed the good questions, but you're right. Population is an issue for the world. The last UN population projection that was just released, I think, a matter of a month or two ago, showed that we'd have 9.3 billion people by 2050 and maybe 10 billion by 2100, and that's an enormous number of people. We've already got 7 billion. We've just passed that landmark in the last few weeks, and we've got to somehow clothe and food all of those, provide the basics for all those people. Now, that's a challenge in itself. But if we want to do something about the population problem, we have to look at it globally, and we know what needs to be done. Most of the population growth that's going to occur between now and the end of the century, present company accepted, is going to occur in the poorest countries of the world, the poorest 40-odd countries. There, women have an average of 5.5 children, compared with here in Australia of less than 2. If we're interested in dealing with the population issue, the effective way of dealing with that is having a proper foreign aid program that focuses on bringing benefits to the poorest women in the world, basically, bringing levels of education up and giving them economic opportunity. We know if we do that, we'll reduce overall population growth. That's how it's happened in our society and everywhere else it's been tried. So, making sure that we're properly resourcing that enterprise, supporting our foreign aid budget is tremendously important, and focusing it that way. If we achieve that, we may end up with a population of only 8 billion by 2050. I mean, that's at the most optimistic end of the projection if we really get on our bike and work hard. Now, the question of whether we'll need to give anything up or not is a very good one as well. And I think that, you know, there may be a priori reasons for believing that that's the case, but one of the things that we certainly need to do is starting to pay for our pollution. Because if we can develop the technologies that are cleaner and more efficient and ultimately become cheaper, which have less impact on the environment, then we have a much better chance of sustaining it at 8 billion or 9 billion people or whatever it happens to be. So our contribution, I think, has to be twofold. One, paying for our pollution and making sure we foster innovation in those areas, and secondly, making sure that we're doing the right thing by the poorest people on the planet.
Okay, next question.
My name is Dominic Pecorari. I'm an architect of 27 years here in Alice Springs. Before my question, I'd just like to see around, are there any aldermen here from the Alice Springs Town Council? If there are any here, could you put your hands up?
I was a bit into it.
Why am I not surprised?
I can't see any from up here.
Are there any anyone here from the NT Parliament? Any politicians here? CLP or Labor? Doesn't matter? Anyone? Greens? Saved. One person. Do you see a problem in that you are preaching to the converted? The people that are here are all on side. But the people who are making decisions about this town and about what goes on in real life, the reality that we talk about, are not informed. They're the least informed, in my opinion. And from the experience we've got here in Alice Springs, this is very telling. You've had a chance to have a look around the town. Did you get to go down to Asri, the Kilgariff subdivision, which is being pushed by the NT government and our local council and everybody, which is a far-flung suburb? Alice Springs is not only just doing its own thing by way of going against urban sprawl in spreading the town itself, but it's actually going even further than that. It's creating suburbs that are the most far-flung in the town. Is there any wisdom in that?
Okay. Well, look, I might just start off by explaining a little bit more about what we do when we have a visit like this to a town such as Alice Springs. This community forum is really the sort of centrepiece of what we do, where we reach out to the community. And you're quite right, most people who come here have a pre-existing interest in it. But I reckon there's absolutely nothing wrong with empowering people a bit further, giving them more information, you know, sharing the commitment that people have. I think that's a very valid thing to do. Over the next day or so, we'll be meeting other groups in the community. In fact, we've already met some Indigenous leaders talking about health issues earlier today, and I've done some media. Tomorrow we'll be meeting some politicians, I think including Mr Hampton. We'll be going out to schools, we'll be talking to other leaders, and having a business breakfast as well on Friday morning. So we do get about, and sometimes those sort of conversations are better off held not in a public space, but where people can be a bit freer to express their views. So we do try to have an impact and spread as far as we can with these visits. In terms of the urban subdivisions, you're probably in a far better position than any of us to comment on that. All I think I know and we'd all agree on is that, you know, any development now should be a absolute splendid opportunity to really showcase the best in low emissions technologies and energy efficiency and overall low impact development.
Hi, my name's Nathan. A question for you, Tim. Just the impact climate change will have on flora and fauna, native and introduced species. Will they be able to adapt?
I'll probably take that one. I got interested in this topic 20 years ago and haven't let it alone ever since. Yes, look, all plants and animals, all species on Earth will be affected by climate change, and indeed most species already are being affected, and we're already seeing things like mobile species shifting to cooler places, things that can fly or swim. We're also seeing a lot of species change in their life cycles, so a lot of things are doing the normal things that they do in spring earlier in the year as it's getting warmer. So even though we've had less than a degree of warming since pre-industrial times overall, we are seeing very, very sensitive responses from species. So Global estimates of species extinctions due to climate change are really quite frightening. For example, I read a paper the other day that estimated that for every degree of warming, we'll lose about 500 land birds in terms of extinction. Similarly, the IPCC estimated in the 2007 report that between 30 and 40% of species globally will be threatened with extinction with 2 to 3 degrees of warming above pre-industrial levels. We're already seeing enormous impacts of bleaching on places like the Great Barrier Reef, and for the first time this year, the Ningaloo, or first time in 2006 actually, the Ningaloo Reef, for example, off Western Australia started to bleach, and it bleached very badly in the last few months. So there will be enormous impacts and we will lose a lot of species.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, this is a question that's been posed to us already by Mr. Jeremy Gillen. Is it possible to have large-scale solar power stations to replace fossil fuel power stations?
There you go. And I suppose anything's possible at a price. I think where we've got to with solar technology, and it's developing rapidly, is that it's still not seen as an economic baseload provider to compete with coal and gas, even carrying a carbon price. But it's one of those things that once the investment environment settles down, i.e. there is a long-term price on carbon, then a lot more investment will start to go into those things. They also need to be given a kickstart sometimes, and I think we've seen examples of that. For example, for solar panels, the solar cities, and there's another program by the current government to trial some of the big new technologies or emerging technologies in solar. So in 80 years' time, say, you'll see a lot of it around. How we get there, the market will ultimately determine. But as of today, if we were building a new power station in a major population area, it would in all likelihood go to gas, which is seen very much as a bridging fuel until we actually get some of these new renewable technologies up at scale that can handle baseload electricity. You've also got and the prices are falling dramatically, but the battery technology and the storage technology needs to be at the right price to make it economic, and there's a lot of research going into that. So it's not today, but in a few years' time, I think you're going to see a proliferation of renewable baseload power.
Could I just add to that, Jerry? I was in Japan recently, in Tokyo, and went out to the Panasonic Corporation. They're developing an old factory site there into 1,000 household redevelopment subdivision. And they had the most incredible plan there. They make the most energy, the most efficient solar panels that you can buy commercially. And they're going to put 5 kilowatts worth of solar panels on every roof there. They also have these little fuel cells, these ceramic fuel cells, which take natural gas and burn it very efficiently to generate electricity. And they also have battery storage for the electricity generated by these houses. And the battery storage astonished me because it was a little tiny thing about that big, which was enough battery support for the solar panel array. It was about 3 kilowatts of support. And inside, all that the battery was hundreds and hundreds of those little rechargeable AA Eneloop batteries. That's all it was, for 3 kilowatts worth of power. And they can do 1,500 charges reliably. And this particular subdevelopment, which they're starting to build next year, and it'll be finished by 2018, although people will be living in it before that, will generate all of the electricity required by that entire community. So for all of the shops, all of the schools, everything else, as well as what people use, as well as the transport, because it's going to all be electric cars. So that's an incredible development, I think, where people right now can do something like that. And I'm sure that's the way of the future. We're going to see more and more of that as time goes on, and as Jerry said, as prices come down.
Okay, next question.
Donald from a Sydney Sider, working temporarily here. Can I ask about the prospects for carbon storage technologies? Because as far as I can see, it's too little, too late, and the coal industry has shown its lack of faith in it by putting very little money into research into it.
Jerry, probably.
I think globally there's been a hell of a lot of research going into carbon sequestration, and there's quite a few pilots around the world. I'm not hearing as much noise like you as there was a few years ago in Australia, but there is a pilot going on in Australia, and I know that the government has been putting in place legislation that will allow will cover some of the risks that are associated with putting something. The uncertainty which you create by putting something underground that could potentially come out again. So I think it's bubbling along, and I think it will be globally. It will be part of the solution. And one of the things that's become very clear through the evolution of this debate is there is no silver bullet. It's going to take a lot of different activities and technologies, and in the right places, sequestration of carbon will be part of it. And I think, for example, in places like Victoria, there's some very real opportunities, and it won't be that long, I suspect, before we're starting to see it trialled at industrial scale, because most of what's happened in the past has been at less than industrial scale. But the technology is there, it does work, but they still haven't cracked the regulatory risks. And once again, without a clear economic and regulatory direction and a price on carbon, you're not going to get the sort of research and development that you need to actually make these things happen.
It was my understanding that high urban density as a solution to environmental issues was debunked in the 1980s. Yet urban planners still promote high density urban living as an environmental solution. Should we be living in places like Alice Springs, or should we be living in sustainable cities? And is local better?
Is anyone going to let me off the hook?
Look, I'll take a bit of a crack at that. Yeah, I think things have changed a lot in terms of building design and materials and so on in the 2000s compared to the 1980s, and I think there has been some research done. At least I can speak about Canberra, which is maybe a bit atypical, but maybe it isn't because it's very suburban. That high-density housing in Canberra, on average, people use less water and electricity per capita than they do out in the suburbs. So, in fact, it does give you a gain in going into properly designed high-density housing. But the other benefit it gives you in larger cities like Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, Perth, and so on, is the transport issue. Is that transport is a big emitter. It's one of the big-ticket items. And so one of the big challenges is to move people away from private motor cars in large cities. You have congestion problems, you have all sorts of other problems in addition to emissions. And high-density housing allows you to build a very good public transport system, various types of rail, bus, rapid transit, and so on, which greatly reduces emissions and reduces congestion. So there's a package of land-use transport issues around more compact cities with high-quality density housing, which does indeed reduce emissions. So it is one part of the solution, I think, in this century.
But I think it does come back to the point that Tim made earlier, that there's got to be the right approach taken to planning on a holistic basis when you're building new housing and developing the infrastructure that we require, that's required for population growth in cities. And I would have to say that when I look at Melbourne, in general, it hasn't been well done. You've got brand new suburbs popping up without any public transport infrastructure, and that's going to come back and bite us in the future big time.
It's funny, one of the things that always amazed me when you drive through some of the western suburbs of Sydney, you see people who've been willing to spend $20,000 on a Greek portico for the front of their house. They could have spent $20,000 on solar panels and never had another electricity bill, but instead the Greek portico won out, and you think, well, I don't know, not quite why, but...
In terms of food, are sustainable cities able to provide their own food, or do we need rural towns and remote towns?
Yeah, look, there's been some work done on that too, and I think there is potential for at least part of food supply to come even from compact cities. If you go to some of the European cities, Stockholm, Sweden is a good example, where they have community gardens, and that's a high-density city with very good public transport with, believe it or not, a lot of renewable energy generated around that region, and at the same time producing a fair bit of their food in the city. But it's through community gardens rather than suburbs with their own individual gardens. And that's being trialled in Canberra, I know, too, in the future. So I think it's going to be a mix. One of the things that's a real concern, though, and I think you've raised a good point, is that as urban centres tend to sprawl out, they tend to consume some of the best agricultural land, which tends to be in the peri-urban area. So there's a real concern. I know the western areas of Sydney are really contested landscapes now as the city pushes out toward the Blue Mountains and so on. So I think you've raised an important issue that when we look at climate issues and energy issues, which we're looking at here, you need to put that in the context of very careful planning that brings other, what we call ecosystem services, biodiversity conservation, food production, water quality, water resources. All that has to come into the mix. And I think both Jerry and Tim have pointed out that to do this properly, you can't silo climate change. It has to be in this more holistic planning framework. So I think you have raised some really good points that we need to consider.
Now, I just have a concern. You know, as you said, the population's reached 7 billion, and we're having these problems with arable land getting taken up by cities. And in a landscape such as ours out here, which is naturally burnt, anytime we have rain, we have fuel loads, that the government's spending tens of millions of dollars on buying up land and locking it into carbon farms in a region such as this. So, one, why are we locking up viable farms for carbon farms when we're having these shortages of food? And two, is it really an efficient, way to spend all this revenue that's being raised on locking up, country out here?
Look, I'm not familiar with this local situation. I understand that Henbury has been purchased by R.M. Williams and will be used as some sort of carbon, or maybe some area to experiment on how to capture carbon. But what I do know is I travel around Australia and talk to farmers and graziers and so forth, is that what they're looking at is opportunities to both sequester carbon and run a viable agricultural business. And just to give you a couple of examples of that, that mate that I mentioned who's got the solar tractor, he practices what's called zero-till agriculture, which means they have a very light plough with just like a sort of a scalpel blade that doesn't disturb the perennial grasses, so they sow their crops right in among the perennial grasses. And that, of course, helps with soil moisture and soil carbon and all the rest of it. In northern Australia, I know people who run cattle, and what they'd love to do is be able to fence off the rough country because they can't control cattle back there, it's not very productive anyway, and concentrate their efforts in the better part of their block. Now, some of that may also qualify as a means of sequestering carbon. I've already talked about the burning patterns that'll go forward. Other people use a rotation of their sheep to make sure that, and their cattle to make sure that they can manipulate pasture in particular ways. It seems to improve soil carbon and so forth. Now, I'm not saying any of these things is going to be a great breakthrough that's going to earn people millions of dollars, but as we develop experience with the Carbon Farming Initiative, I'm sure we're going to find ways of running viable agricultural and productive agricultural properties alongside the sequestration of carbon. And of course then it's plantings of trees and all that sort of stuff as well. So there's a whole lot of things I think that we're going to see develop in that way. I don't think it's either or, I think it's going to be both.
My name is Jimmy Cocky, I'm from the Arid Lands Environment Centre. Given that climate change is part of a number of factors that are contributing to global change, whether it's economic issues, population, various other issues, the Clean Energy Future Policy is essentially a mitigation strategy. It's a revenue neutral, putting money into clean energy, but not so much into, it's all about mitigation, and there's not a whole lot in there about adaptation. I'd like to hear what some of the panel have got to say about the role of sovereign wealth funds in adaptation, but also the concerns around the exclusion of everything but coal and iron ore from that sovereign wealth, from potential sovereign wealth fund that could lead to perverse outcomes such as coal gasification or uranium mining.
I'll start off, talk a little bit about adaptation, then hand over to somebody else. Yes, you're absolutely right. The Clean Energy Fund is mostly about mitigation, though as part of that fund there is, as an ecologist, delighted to hear nearly $1 billion put forward as a biodiversity fund for mostly for adaptation research. Under the Howard government, actually, that government set aside $50 million for a National Climate Change Adaptation Research Facility, NCARF, which is still going. It's in its 4th year of operation, and that's been giving money to researchers in 8 different sectors, actually 9 different sectors, including Indigenous communities, to do research on adaptation. So there is a great deal of research going on around the country on adaptation. And the other thing that I think we've all been struck with as we've been going around the country visiting regional centres is almost every council that we've talked to and many other local organisations now have adaptation plans. And we were listening this morning to the Northern Territory, to somebody talking about the Northern Territory adaptation plan, which is in draft form. So I think there is a lot of thinking going into adaptation. You know, you could argue that there's not enough and it's a bit late, but it's certainly as much a part of climate change thinking now as I think mitigation is. Because everybody now should recognise that even if we stopped emitting greenhouse gases tomorrow, we'd still get another degree by 2030, and we do have to deal with that.
It was about the role of national sovereign wealth funds, because a place like Norway, they've got lots of oil, they put lots of money aside for future generations, because the way it's looking with the superannuation, pensions, we're talking about poverty, we're talking about people's future. It's if the economic situation deteriorates and there's no funding there to actually pay for adaptation, because it actually requires infrastructure and it requires community and more regional infrastructure as opposed to research, which is good and very important, but adaptation's a local response as opposed to mitigation being a global response. So my question is about the importance and the role of national sovereign wealth funds for adaptation, but also the fact that the one that's currently there, and I'm not asking you to comment too specifically on government policy, but the resource rent tax that's there is only focused really on coal and iron ore. And the coal, our concern here, especially with the Great Artesian Basin and some big coal reserves out in the Simpson Desert, is that there's a push towards gasification of coal, which can lead to underground burning, which can lead to lots more emissions than what they might put in their environmental impact statement. We're also concerned that the uranium, which has quite a lot of deposits around here, the cumulative impacts of lots of exploration projects and potential mines, what might be the local impacts on that, but because they're not included in a resource rent tax, they're not contributing to a sovereign wealth fund. So is there a risk that if they're excluded, that they will then have an unfair advantage over other solutions?
Jerry?
I wish we had Roger Beale here with us, our economist, because I struggle.
At the end of the day, a sovereign wealth fund is a national asset that you're building so that you can actually use it for something in the future. I think the current wealth fund that we have is actually to look after largely, I think, public service pensions. And I mean that because it's an unfunded liability, so it's perfectly legitimate. But I don't think a great deal of thought has been given to what is going to happen with the funds that have been generated out of the the new tax. But I think as a point of principle, it would be good for a place like Australia to be able to come out of what is going to be an extraordinarily good time economically, compared with many other places in the world because of the boom that's going on with the increased demand out of Asia. It'd be really great if Australia could put significant amounts aside or put significant amounts of money into futuristic infrastructure to ensure that we do have a better future for our kids. So I think in principle, I think you're right, but I think ultimately it's going to be a policy question as to what actually happens with those funds. But my personal view is I think we run the risk in Australia of squandering some of the short-term benefits that we're getting out of the mining boom and the extraordinary prosperity that we wouldn't have predicted 20 years ago that we've got today. That's a personal view. But,
Hi, my name's Bronwyn Grieve. I'm from Alice Springs, and it's actually a really simple question, just wanting clarification in the slideshows. And I'm asking this because that point that you made of us about being communicators out there. You were saying, and correct me if I'm wrong, that Central Australia is heating up faster than the rest of Australia? And if that's so, why is that? That's all.
Okay, it's heating up faster than the coastal regions, and that's a general phenomenon for every continent around the Earth. And that's because you're further away from the ocean. The ocean is a huge sink of heat. It warms up much more slowly than the land, and it buffers the temperature rise along the coastline. When we get to equilibrium sometime down the future, the coast will start warming up a bit more than they are today. But for the foreseeable future, for centuries into the future, the centres of the continents are going to warm at a faster rate than the coastal areas. General phenomenon.
Thank you very much. Vicky McLeod from the Northern Territory Government. I'd just like to thank you all for coming to Alice Springs. Your knowledge and information has been very valuable. But I also just did want to just take advantage of your captive audience. Your point that you make about having a positive attitude and being about creative and having innovation as a response is a point that's very well made. And I just wanted to advise everyone here that the Northern Territory Government currently has community climate change grants out, and expressions of interest are due next week. So anyone with a community grant who has an idea, energy efficiency, climate change technology, something like that, please make more details are online. Thank you.
No worries, thank you very much. Tim, I might get you to say a closing statement, mate.
Sure. Thank you. Well, look, could I thank you all for coming this evening and being so patient and having such a great load of questions to ask us. In a few minutes, we're going to stop and have a cup of tea and coffee, and the commissioners will mix about a bit, and we're happy to answer any other questions that you might throw at us. But just as a personal observation, could I say I've been coming to this town now for 30 years, and it's changed phenomenally. I was so pleased when I came through today and saw the new solar array out by the airport that's supplying quite a bit of your airport's energy needs. And I just think the opportunities in a community like this for particularly solar power and particularly for leading the way as to how we integrate solar into a grid, they're just enormous. I live in Sydney on standalone solar panels, and we get a hell of a lot more cloudy days than you do, but I tell you, it still provides every bit of electricity I need for my house and home office and water pumps and all the rest. So I just encourage you to be bold and experiment, and no more Greek porticos, but plenty more solar panels. Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you very much to the panel. All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Australian Climate Commission's Community Forum. My name is Ryan Little. I'm a born and raised local of Alice Springs, and I work for the local television station here as a newsreader and reporter, and tonight I'll be the facilitator of this event. Okay, now the Commission's present tonight are Professor Tim Flannery, Mr Jerry Houston, Professor Leslie Hughes, Professor Will Steffen, and Dr Suzanne Elliott. But, ladies and gentlemen, before we start this evening, I would like to introduce Barbara Satur, a native title holder from Luratupa Aboriginal Corporation, to perform a welcome to country. Make your way up, please, Annie Barb.
My name is Barbara Satur, those who don't know me. I'm a member of the Little family, and I'm a traditional owner of Mbarntu, which is Alice Springs. I'm a director on the Luratupa Aboriginal Corporation. We're made up of 3 estate groups. One is Undulu, is the east of us. Ilkmer is up on the north, and Mbarntu is in the middle. We called our corporation Luratupa, meaning the banks of the river. Lura is the banks of the river, and the Tupa is the backbone or the spine. So I always say that the Todd River is our backbone and spine of Alice Springs because it runs through the centre of the town. And when the Todd flows, it's a healing feeling, I think, and it's a cleansing of the town. So everyone who's witnessed it or saw that Todd flow any time in their lifetime, they know the feeling of it. So thank you very much for having me here, and enjoy the forum. Thank you.
Thank you, Annie Barb. Okay, also the aim of the evening is to begin a conversation. The Commission is here to listen, as well as to share some of their knowledge and their background of their experiences. We'll hear from them on what they've heard and seen in Alice Springs today, and there will also be an opportunity to ask questions for the Commission. But firstly, a brief introduction of Professor Tim Flannery, the Chief Climate Commissioner. Professor Tim Flannery is one of Australia's leading writers on climate change and an internationally acclaimed scientist, explorer and conservationist. He was named Australian of the Year back in 2000.
Term unequivocal to describe our confidence in that bit of science. Well, you might ask why. Some people say, well, the Earth is always warmed and it's always cooled. So why isn't this just natural variability? Well, I could go on for the next couple hours to tell you all the evidence. There's a mountain of it that tells us that this is not natural variability. But the basic piece of evidence is we actually know the physics really well. And the warming is due to these things called greenhouse gases, a belt of gases a few kilometers up in the air above the Earth's surface. The principle is very simple. Sunlight from the Earth warms the Earth's surface, and as it does so, the Earth has to give the equivalent amount of energy back into space, or else we would continually warm and burn up, and we don't. But the Earth gives it back not as light, but as heat. And these gases let the light through, but they trap the heat. And fundamentally, that's the greenhouse effect. So that extra heat that's trapped below this belt of gases warms the lower atmosphere and the surface, the land, the oceans, the ice. And that's what's causing the warming we're seeing now. As I said, I could go through a very exhaustive list of evidence, but I'll just give you one piece because it's quite interesting to see this. Now here's a graph from 1900 to 2000, and there's nothing on it yet. So what we're going to do is test our climate model, because our climate model actually has the physics of the greenhouse effect built into it. There are other things that affect climate, of course. Sunlight varies, volcanoes occur, and so on. So we can tell our model from 1900 to 2000, put in all the natural variability that people like to talk about, and we can do that, and that's what temperature would have done. Temperature is not steady naturally, it varies, and that's how it would have varied, okay? But then we can tell our climate model, leave all the natural variability in, but add in the greenhouse gases, because we know how much additional greenhouse gas we've put in. So we do that, and that's what our climate model does. Look, it diverges around 1950, and it says greenhouse gases will have a measurable impact after the middle of last century. Now we see a difference. We can test the model, because this has already occurred. So we send our Bureau of Meteorology scientists out, and we say, go measure what actually happened, and the scientist does that, and that black line is
2007, and is currently Panasonic's chair in environmental sustainability at the Macquarie University. Professor Flannery has held various academic positions, including Professor at the Macquarie University, Director of the South Australian Museum in Adelaide, Principal Research Scientist at the Australian Museum, and Visiting Chair in Australian Studies at Harvard University in the Department of Organismic and Evolutionary Biology. So please, ladies and gentlemen, make him feel welcome, Professor Tim Flannery.
Well, thank you very much for that welcome, and thank you, Barbara, for that very beautiful welcome to country. That was fantastic. This is the Climate Commission's 13th event, believe it or not, going around Australia talking about climate change, and I'm very pleased to be here in Alice Springs because it's the first time that we've been in the Northern Territory. I'd just like to tell you a bit about the Commission and how it works, and then we'll hand over to you, because this really is your evening. This is, we think, your opportunity to interact with our commissioners and ask whatever you want about any aspect of climate change. The Climate Commission is an independent authority. We've been set up by government and we're funded by government, but we're independent of government. So we don't take directions from the Minister, for example. And our brief is a very simple one. It's really just to get out there among the Australian community, make the expertise of the commissioners available, and engage in a dialogue on all aspects of climate change. We think it's an important job because climate change is going to be with us for many years to come, that's for sure. We'll still be discussing issues and making hard decisions in 2050, just as we're doing this decade. And in a democracy without a well-informed public in terms of these issues, it's going to be easy to make mistakes. So we think what we do is important. Because we're independent, we don't give opinions really on government policy or even opposition policy. There's plenty of people who do that. You'll find them anywhere. We figure if we do that, if we refrain from giving opinions about policy, will become known over time more as an authoritative, independent source of information for people, so that you can come to your own conclusion about things rather than hear opinions from us. I'd like to briefly introduce the Commission and give an idea of their expertise. We've got near me there Professor Leslie Hughes of Macquarie University, who is a world authority on the impacts of climate change on biodiversity, so on plants and animals, but also on the area of adapting to climate change. We have Professor Will Steffen next, who's really one of the great international scientists in terms of climate change, particularly the modelling and the global system and how it works and the impact of greenhouse gases on the Earth system as a whole. So Will is really the person to go to if you've got any questions on the science of climate change. We next have Susanna Elliott, Dr. Susanna Elliott from the Australian Science Media Centre. She's an expert on the communication of science. The Australian Science Media Centre does a fantastic behind-the-scenes jobs, really, making sure that science is properly represented in all the media in Australia. And at the end there we have Jerry Houston, who for 34 years was in the oil and gas industry, was president of BP Australasia and has recently stepped down. And he's a great person to approach with any business questions, because coming from business and having thought long and deep about climate change, he is a real expert in that area. The one person we haven't got with us, one commissioner we don't have with us this evening, is Roger Beale, our economist. So we'll do our very best to answer economic questions and recall what Roger said on previous occasions, but we do apologise that he's not available to you this evening. We start off with a brief presentation of climate science, impacts in this area, and a brief look at potential opportunities. And as soon as that's over, we're going to hand over to the floor for you to ask your own questions, because that's really our purpose for being here. Without further ado, I'll hand over to Will Steffen to begin the presentation. He'll then hand on to Leslie, he'll hand on to me, and then we'll go over to questions from the floor. So thank you. Will, please go.
Okay. Thanks very much, Tim. As Tim said, we get a lot of common questions about the basics of the science and what the implications might be. So just to save some time, we'll give you a very brief introduction to it. So we'll start with probably the most iconic piece of scientific data that we use in climate science, and that's the global surface air temperature record from about 1880, which is where we first had thermometers, up to the present. And you can see that every year is not warmer than the one before it. There's a lot of variability from year to year and even over 10-year periods. But the long-term trend, at least since the middle of the last century, is quite clear. The Earth is warming, and it's warming at a rate of about 0.17 degrees Celsius. Since we started the record here, the overall increase is about 0.8 of a degree, a little under 1 degree Celsius, which is actually quite a large change. But interestingly, scientists, although this is an important piece of data, spend just as much time on this next one. This is the ocean heat content. Now, why would we be interested in that? It turns out that about 90% of the extra heat that's being trapped at the Earth's surface actually goes into the ocean. It doesn't go into the air or the land. So for climate scientists, this is really an important piece of data. Again, you can see since about the 1960s or 70s, there's been a clear increase in ocean heat content, which again is telling us that we have a global problem, a global imbalance. And there's even more data we use. This is the Arctic sea ice, in other words, the ice that floats over the North Pole and the ocean around it. And you can see over time, again from 1900, these red jagged lines, that's the observational data. We're losing that sea ice at an increasing rate as we go through time. The line that actually goes out to 2100 is obviously not observations because it hasn't occurred yet. That's an example of a climate model and what a climate model predicts. And you see up here, the climate model does pretty well about the middle of last century. But then as we go through time, the climate model is too conservative. In fact, it's not predicting how fast the climate system is actually moving, and that's true for many of the climate parameters. So the point here is we have a wealth of evidence that the Earth is warming, and scientists don't debate that anymore. That has been settled for quite a few decades. We use the